This is an ABC podcast.
Hello, welcome to The Music Show on Radio National. I'm Andrew Ford. This is the Melbourne band Hiatus Kaiyote. In a minute, we'll be talking to Napalm from Hiatus Kaiyote, and also on today's show, we're going to meet the composer Param Vir. He was born in Delhi 69 years ago. He's lived most of his life in England, and there's a wonderful new album of his music just out.
All the words we don't say, all the words we don't say, all the words we don't say, all the words we don't, all the words we don't, all the words we don't say, all the words we don't say, all the words we don't say, all the words we don't, all the words we don't, all the words we don't say, all the words we don't say, all the words we don't say, all the words we don't, all the words we don't, all the words we don't say, all the words we don't say, all the words we don't say, all the words we don't, all the words we don't.
Hiatus Kaiyote are a band from Melbourne, and they've been around for about 10 years. Very hard to categorise their music, but it's extremely interesting and rather infectious. Their lead singer is Napalm, and we'll meet her in a moment. They've just released their third studio album. It's called Mood Valiant, and that's what we're listening to now. All the Words We Don't Say, that comes from the brand new album Mood Valiant by Hiatus Kaiyote, and I'm very pleased to welcome to the music show the voice that we heard there, and that's Napalm. Welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Listening to that, there's so many layers, so many details. This is music that you could sort of wander into and get slightly lost, but in a pleasant kind of way. Is that the intention, that you create these little worlds?
For sure. I think if you want to create something truly timeless, I think we live in an age where music is like fast food and it's popular and you listen to it a handful of times and then you move on with your life. Whereas my favorite records or composers are the ones where you can listen to it through your whole lifetime and find something new. And I really put a lot of effort into the details so that the more you listen to it, the more it will reveal itself to you.
Yes, and that's good value for money, apart from anything else. Do you work in one particular way? Do the songs, start with a sort of musical framework or maybe a set of lyrics and then you build on that?
There's no real formula. We approach every song like its own little universe, I guess. And also, it's a 4-way collaboration. So we all write for the project. Sometimes I'll write whole songs on guitar with lyrics, and other times we're just expanding off an improvisation in the studio. I think if you limit yourself to a formula, you can get bored. So it's different every time. And at the core of it is just trusting each other's creative expression and developing it.
So sometimes when you're writing a song, you have a fairly clear idea of where it's going to end up sonically, do you? Or is that something which is almost improvised in the studio, in where you try something and you try something else?
For me, when I write, I hear music in my mind and then I translate it. But when it comes to recording, it's never going to be exactly how you imagine it. And that's kind of the beauty in it. Like, it reveals itself to you the further in you go, and you create these spontaneous moments in the studio. But I mean, it's good to have a pretty strong vision when you start.
Yes, but you can always abandon it, of course, can't you? Because, half of the fun is going on a voyage of discovery and finding out what it was you were trying to do all along.
Mm-hmm. I guess I'm a very sentimental writer. I have this theory that music, it's like it already exists in the universe, and I hear it, and then my job as an artist is to translate it for other people. So if it's strong enough, I don't usually abandon it. I just work on it until it's ready. Yeah, I guess you owe it to the idea to try and see it through, even if it changes from how you originally perceived it in your mind.
And how do you know when it's ready?
Well, usually the process is if we all like it, which is quite tricky. When you have 4 very creative, emotional, sensitive artists, for the most part, we have a very strong natural chemistry, but, we don't always agree on everything. So I think the key to our music is everybody needs to love what they do. It's not just like, oh, you play this keys part that you're not happy with, because people will, when you allow them the space to do what they love and what they want, then you get the best results. So usually when we've all worked it out and everybody is happy with their parts, that's usually when we know it's finished. But ultimately, like Bender, the bass player, always says, art is never finished, it's only ever abandoned. Eventually, you got to stop putting paint on the canvas. And I guess it's about knowing when to walk away from it. And usually that moment is when we all agree, when we all like it, which is quite difficult to achieve at times.
And what about deciding what kind of order to put the tracks in? Is that something that dictates itself, or do you wrestle with that?
It's kind of a nice ritual at the end of making an album. Like we have songs individually that we work on, and then when it's time to put it together, it's really fun seeing how songs can flow into each other. And sometimes we'll create new pieces of music right at the end as like an interlude or two to help that bridge. I like albums. I like it to be like a film in a way that you can put a record on and listen to it start to finish, and it will evolve and have a natural journey, as opposed to just like a bunch of songs stacked next to each other.
Yes, yes. And there's, in the middle of this album, there's Hush Rattle, isn't there, which is almost like a sorbet course in a big fat dinner.
Right. Well, it's interesting you say that, because we had Rosewater, which was a song, and then we had the song that goes before Hush Rattle. So Rosewater is based on a piano part that Simon wrote, and it's basically like contrasting time signatures, with the left hand suggesting one time and the right hand suggesting another. I used to sing in a cumbia band, which is like a traditional Colombian style of music. And I used to work with a gaita player, which is this traditional flute. And so we got my friend to play these separate parts. And then when it came to creating an interlude, we ran just the flutes, which is a tiny detail in Rosewater. But we isolated the flutes and then ran it through a space echo, which is like a vintage analog tape machine, and slowed it right down, and then we built everything around that. I wrote the melody when I was in the Amazon staying with the Varinawa community, and there's little samples of the women singing throughout it. So yeah, it was kind of a last minute decision when we were making the album, taking little bits from other songs and expanding on it. And the same thing happened with Flight of the Tiger Lily, which is what opens the record.
Yes.
Arthur Verocai, this great Brazilian composer, he did an arrangement for Get Son, which was horns and strings. And then for the start of the album, we got just the strings from, like a piece of the strings from that song, and then made a whole new piece of music based on that. And that's what the album opens with.
It's like a curtain rising, isn't it?
Yeah. But it relates to something that happens later, which I really love to do in my writing. You see it a lot in classical music, where there might be an original idea or melody, and then it goes through a modulation and it evolves, but then returns back to this original melody, but somehow changed or reharmonized. We like to have that throughout our art, just to tie it all together.
You're listening to The Music Show on Radio National. My guest is Napalm, who is one quarter of Hiatus Kaiyote, and we're talking about the new album, Mood Valiant. You mentioned Arthur Verocai. We must talk about him, perhaps just in general terms for people who don't know his work. I mean, that album that's so sort of a cult album is nearly 50 years old now, isn't it?
Arthur Verocai is a Brazilian composer. He's brilliant. He's like 73 years old, super quirky. And basically, he made this opus of a record, which is self-titled Arthur Verocai, in 1972. And it's stunning, and we all adore it in the band. And so basically, as gorgeous as this album was, it wasn't very commercially successful. And so for like 10 years, he only made advertisement jingles because he was ashamed of it, even though it's the most beautiful record. When hip-hop came around, a lot of artists were sampling his music, and he realized the value in it, and it got a cult following. And so I wanted to celebrate him because, like, if anything, he kind of put his compositional duties aside because of his self-doubt. So I wanted to celebrate him. And rather than just sampling him, because he's a composer and an arranger and a very talented one at that, we tracked him down. And he did an arrangement for Get Son, and it really made it sing. And also, like, it's pretty amazing to be 4 nerdy people in their 30s in Australia and then, like, flying to Rio to work with this icon of an arranger was really special, and not a lot of people get to do that nowadays.
Everything I've read about the band in preparing to talk to you today describes your music in a different way. You know, there's I think there's one article I read talked about you as jazzers, or maybe, and the funk is a word that comes up quite a lot. Hip hop comes up, electro comes up. I'm guessing that you all take a kind of perverse glee in being as uncategorizable as you are.
Humans like category. Humans like order and structure, but it's kind of like opposed to the natural world in a way. I think the natural world is chaotic, and artists are in tune with that. So, I mean, I always found it super interesting that people like to pigeonhole us as one particular genre, but we love everything. And when we're making stuff, there's so many influences from everywhere. And we can fly to Rio and work with a Brazilian composer, but people just hear soulful music and they're like, oh, it's R&B. And it's like, it's so much more than that. There's cumbia influence, there's classical influence, there's, you know, electronica from the 1950s. We don't make music to fit in a box, you know, you just kind of draw in from your influences and see where it ends up.
Yes. Some of your collaborations, of course, have been affected without your leaving home. I mean, the music goes out there and people seize upon it and use it. And we're talking about the likes of Kendrick Lamar and Drake and Beyonce and Jay-Z. Does that make you feel like you're part of a kind of bigger musical conversation?
Yeah, for sure. But in a really bizarre way, you know, I think our music is complex and super creative, which is kind of a thing. It's like career suicide in a way, you know, where you basically isolate yourself from the majority because it's not necessarily the most palatable. But the interesting thing is that even without the intention of being pop music, pop artists find inspiration from what we're doing and translate it to their style and their audience, you know. And I think the biggest thing for me was like when Drake sampled us, I never really listened to his music before he sampled us. I knew he was really famous, but for the most part, everybody in the band listens to like obscure African records or like soundtracks from films. Like it's not really in our everyday bread and butter as far as music we listen to, but it's powerful too, you know. Like I went and saw him perform at Rod Laver Arena. He opened up his show with the sample, which is basically just me and Simon, and it's a cappella, and hearing it in that format was really crazy. You know, it means we can continue to be super niche and creative, but also that it has something tangible enough that pop artists find value in it, which is cool.
It's been a while since you were able to tour, of course, and you must be itching to get out on the road again. But I wonder, what's the relationship between your live gigs and what you do in the studio? Are you trying to capture the live energy in the studio, or are you trying to reproduce the complexity of the studio on stage?
I guess it's both. There's often with tracking, we'll play things together live just because it has a certain energy. There's a magic to it. But then some of our songs are produced, and when we go to perform it live, you have to think outside of the box as far as sounds and things like that. So they both kind of influence the other. It's like you want to be able to have the energy of playing together live, but also the intricacies of how the sounds communicate with each other on a studio record. The interesting thing about not being able to tour is usually when you finish an album, we go out on the road and you directly experience how people are enjoying the music, or you having people sing along and things like that. Whereas because we're not touring, it's quite insular and all you have to go off is like people writing to you. So it's quite a strange time to have a body of work out in the world, but not to see the response in person. But also the blessing in that is that we're already working on the next album, you know. And for me, I love performing, but I think my real happy place is creating in the studio.
Thank you very much indeed, Napalm, for being my guest on the music show. Congratulations on the album. I'm going to go and listen to it all again, armed with the various bits of information you've given us, and see if I can hear things that I didn't hear the last time. Thanks.
Thanks for your time. Take care.
If I were a laughing slug, I would reach out with the blue Roosevelts, wrapping myself around you high up in the treetops. We could get lost in our lust. Ooh, us. If I were a seahorse, I'd only dance around you underneath the green water. I could fill you up, you could be my daddy. We could get lost in our lust. Oh, us. And it's all I wanna do. And it's all I wanna do.
Chivalry is not dead. That's from Mood Valiant, the latest album from Hiatus Kaiyote, and I was speaking to Napalm from Melbourne. The album's out now. All going well, Hiatus Kaiyote are supposed to be touring soon. At the end of September, they should be in Canberra, and then there are dates in Newcastle, Sydney, Perth, Adelaide, and Brisbane. You're listening to The Music Show on Radio National. Param Vir is a British Indian composer who uses aspects of both Western and Indian classical music in his work, but he doesn't want it to be called crossover, and as you will hear, it isn't. PV, as he's known, moved to the United Kingdom in the 1980s from his home in Delhi, and he studied music with people like Peter Maxwell Davies and Oliver Knussen. He's had works commissioned for the Proms, for major British orchestras and festivals, and indeed an opera was written for the Aldborough Festival. There's a new album out on the NMC label called Wheeling Past the Stars. The title comes from Rabindranath Tagore, and we'll be speaking about that poet in this conversation. But we'll start with a piece for Sarod and ensemble. It's called Raga Fields. This is how it starts. That's the opening of Raga Fields, the sarod player Sumik Datta with Klangforum Wien, and it's music by Param Vir. And I'm very pleased to welcome Param Vir to the music show. PV, thank you for joining me. Maybe you could tell us about that piece and in particular about the role of the sarod.
I was very interested in exploring a new way to use the sound of the sarod. So there's two aspects of this. The sarod as sound producing instrument with a very unique sound, and then the whole idea of Indian classical music and what it can do. Now, I was not wanting to replicate a performance of Indian classical music because there are great maestros who can do that much better than myself. So the whole point was to take the music out of the expectations of a classical music concert of Indian music and to produce something that was contemporary and yet respectful to both the traditions of Indian music and Western music. When I started to conceive the piece musically in terms of musical images, I found it almost impossible to conceive what that sound could be if I started off listening to a sarod in my head, because it of course brought up Indian classical images. So I started always with imagining the ensemble, the contemporary ensemble playing music that I was interested to write, and then I was able to bring the sarod into that in a very different way.
And how much of the sarod part is notated?
I would say probably about 45% maybe. So there are three movements, and the first movement is entirely improvised, and the Western ensemble plays harmonic elaborations in the background. They come about 4 or 5 times in waves, and then they simply bring it to a climax. And in this space, which I created for the soloist, he is completely free to invent what he wants. The choice of rag I left to him, but I did tell him that it had to match the notes on the ensemble. I think he chose between 1 or 2 different ragas in different performances, and the blend worked very well.
Structurally, the beginning of your piece, I mean, it resembles an alap, doesn't it, at the beginning of a raga. It's very introductory, and the sarod establishes a sense of drone. And one of the things that I find rather compelling about the piece is the way in which that is stretched. The music struggles away from that drone. And it sounds a bit like a struggle because the sarod seems to want to stay where it was.
Well, that first movement could be described as a hitchhiker's guide to the galaxy of an alap, which normally takes 2 hours in a live performance, and we had to do it in about 9 minutes. 8 or 9 minutes. So it is incredibly speeded up. People suggested I should use a tabla and drone instruments such as tanpura, but that would have just made it sound like an Indian classical music performance. And the point is that the orchestra replicates the role of the tabla and the role of the tanpura.
In the third movement, I know you said your aim was not to produce crossover or Indian music, but nevertheless there's a sort of big unison tune that the strings have, which certainly sounds as though it belongs in India.
So that is my idea of a joke. So I'll tell you what exactly happens there. Thank you for asking the question. If you listen to most of these so-called sitar and other Indian music concertos, the orchestra suffers from a very unique disease called unisonitis, which means that everything is playing in unison. And I said, what's the point of an orchestra playing melodies in unison? It points to the fact that these arrangers that invariably write these works haven't figured out what to do with the harmonic aspect of the work, the contrapuntal aspect of the work. They don't know how to use it, so they put everything in unison, and that's kind of pointless. And it's actually even disrespectful to the orchestra, which is an extraordinarily elaborate, brilliant instrument with fantastic musicians playing in it. So I started off my work with joke, with these unisons, and then suddenly it goes crazy, and then it says, right, I can do more than that, and then it goes off into harmonic spectrums. So it's a joke. I hope it made you laugh anyway.
It did, and I did notice the point at which it sort of
it suddenly breaks off, exactly.
Blurred.
Yeah.
And, although of course there is a wonderful piece by one of your teachers, Oliver Nusson's Coursing, which has a wonderful unison opening. So there's nothing wrong with unisons, is there?
Oh, no, God, no. But that unison, my goodness, that unison and coursing, when I first encountered that, I'm just so completely knocked out by that piece because it's extremely highly colored unison, you know. In fact, that unison you will also find on this CD in Before Krishna. It starts with a unison, because Ollie asked me to actually write a melody because I was always overlaying everything at that time. So he said, write just a line. So I wrote this line, but then it goes right across the orchestra.
On today's music show, I'm speaking to the composer Param Vir, and I'd like to ask about the songs in the middle of this album, which is where the album Wheeling Past the Stars gets its title. 4 songs, 2 words by the Bengali poet Rabindranath Tagore. Maybe just a word about Tagore for people who don't know who he was and his importance for India, for Bengal, for Bangladesh, for that matter.
Well, yes, he is the composer that wrote the national anthems of India and Bangladesh. I mean, of course, Bangladesh didn't exist during his lifetime. It came to be much later. But he was quite remarkable. Around the time when I was 16, we had this Czechoslovak revolution, which I heard about in my school. And this made me very excited because it's the first time that I suddenly plunged into international politics and human rights. And that became from that point on a burning preoccupation that remains today with me and inspires many of my artistic responses. So at that time I wrote, of course, about this in a newspaper. It was published the very next day. The fact that people's democratic aspirations were being suppressed by an oppressive regime. But I also wrote a long essay, I think just for myself. I showed it to 1 or 2 teachers. And in this, I quoted this amazing Tagore poem, Where the Mind is Without Fear and the Head is Held High. It was an image of a country that is free of oppression. And I think many Indian school children learned this poem in the original translation from Bengali by Tagore. William Redicher has done a modern translation of that, which is absolutely stunning. I didn't think it was even translatable after the Tagore translation, but he has actually made a verse translation. So at some point I'm going to set that. So that was how Tagore came into my work. And I would say, I suppose, that he is the most famous and most well-known 20th century poet from India.
And you chose 4 of his poems from different parts of his life. I would like us to listen to Grandfather's Holiday, which is almost like a Satyajit Ray film in poetic form. And that was Patricia Ochterlony, the soprano, Ulrich Heinen, the cellist, performing the third of the 4 songs, Wheeling Past the Stars, music by Param Vir. And Param Vir is my guest on today's music show here on Radio National. PV, the piece was commissioned by the late Rohan Dasaram, a cellist. An interesting combination of soprano and cello, not an obvious one, and maybe not such an easy one to work with.
Rohan Dasaram very specifically wanted me to write a song cycle with a soprano, and he loves the work of Tagore, and he asked me to use Tagore's words if I could. And of course, by that time, I had already encountered William Redich's translations. I was aware of these poems, so I said, that's wonderful. I know William very well. And William had already been the librettist of my very first opera, Snatched by the Gods, based on a Tagore poem. So it was a natural choice. And I chose poems that showed different facets of Tagore's character and personality, if you like.
On today's music show, I'm speaking to the composer Param Vir. Perhaps you could tell us, PV, about your early life. You were born in Delhi. Well, at what point did you decide you wanted to be a composer?
I saw a Western musical kind of film. It was called State Fair.
Oh.
I haven't looked it up, but there was a tune in that which went, "Our State Fair is a great state fair," something like that. So I thought I would write a piece called State Fair. I was 10 years old and I didn't actually even have a piano at home. For the first year or two, we couldn't afford a piano. So I used to go to my school to practice on the school piano every day. And I had to pay 5 rupees a month to use the piano, which is about 5 pence in today's currency equation. And I worked out this piece on a harmonium. And it was all in crotchets. You can imagine it was all triads in the left hand and a little tune in the right hand. And then I played it to my music teacher, and she said that. And then I sang it. Then I was singing it in quavers and crotchets, but I'd only written crotchets because I didn't think I knew how to write quavers. So she said it's all wrong, and then we just got on with the lesson, and that was the end of my composing for another 2 or 3 years. But when I was 13 was one of the key things that happened in my life. I was involved with the International Cooperation Club in my school, and I used to regularly get British Council or British High Commission newsletters about the musical world there and so on. And I read about Oliver Knussen. He was the same age as me, and he was writing a symphony and a song cycle and something else. So I just saw that, and it sparked that composition gene again. And I thought to myself, I can also do that.
And going to the UK, you ended up working with Ollie, and I think, it's hard to imagine a more appropriate teacher for you, not only because he had, in a sense, sparked your interest in composition in the first place, but also because more than anybody else I can think of, more than anybody I've ever met, he knew all music, or at least all Western music, and could point you in the direction of any piece which he thought would be appropriate for you to listen to.
I think I would say that his primary role in my education was to literally help me to find good bearings. He played me many examples of not just necessarily contemporary, the whole of the 20th century. He put it on a cassette tape. And because I valued these lessons, I recorded all the lessons with him, with a little Walkman Professional sitting on the floor. It was very much a question of his pointing me in the right direction in terms of what kinds of musical templates to look at. I think the first piece he put on for me on those tapes was Ligeti's Lontano. And for some reason, I wasn't very impressed by that. I don't know why. And he said, well, you're not very impressed by that. I said, well, it sounds very simple. Anyway, I did analyze it finally and absorb as much as I could from that music.
I'd like us to end our conversation by hearing the closing minutes of the final piece on this album. What does Hayagriva mean?
It's an image, it's an archetype, it's an classical Indian archetype of a god in human form but with a horse's head. And he was known to be the protector of knowledge. It is supposed to be an incarnation of Vishnu, in the same way in which Krishna is also an incarnation of Vishnu. So if you like, my CD has got 2 different incarnations of Vishnu. Again, I liberated the image from anything very traditional, and it shows a very powerful aspect of this archetypal energy in 3 different panels in the music.
And as I said, we'll hear the end. And maybe you could tell us about the significance of the closing bars, because they contain music originally composed by Peter Maxwell Davies, or at least based on something that he had composed.
That's quite right. He had invited me to visit him in Sanday in Orkney, where he lived. And as he had no guest room, I slept in his composing studio right next to his grand piano and worked on his desk. And in fact, he gave me some of his manuscript paper, and that's where I started my piece. And I explained to him that I was writing the piece in 3 segments, and there were 3 different colors, red, green, and blue, in my piece as focuses of musical energy. And he said, well, he wrote a piece with those 3 colors, and it was called Parade. So he showed me the manuscript score. It was lying there in his studio, and there was a recurring 12-note figure, not a 12-tone figure, but a 12-note figure. And I thought I should borrow this. So I asked his permission, which he said, yes, you can borrow it. And I placed it at the very end, just as a signifier of where this piece began its journey, right there in his own studio, and connecting it to a piece that he had written when he was a young composer.
Well, let's listen to it now. Param Vir, it's been a great pleasure talking to you on The Music Show. Thank you very much for being my guest.
Thank you so much.
Hayagriva, that's music by Param Vir, and the last little bit of it by Peter Maxwell Davies. Param Vir's album, Wheeling Past the Stars, is out now on NMC. Sound engineers were Emrys Cronin, Andrei Shabanoff and Bryce Halliday, and the music show is produced by Caitlin Benedict and Ellie Parnell. And I must give a shout out this week to the music show's founding producers, Penny Lomax and Maureen Cooney. They were named this week as recipients of the Richard Gill Award for Distinguished Services to Australian Music. The award is part of the forthcoming 2021 Art Music Awards. It's a big gong. It's one that's been won in the past by the likes of The Necks. The rest of the Art Music Awards are going to be presented online on the 24th of August. We'll leave the last word on today's show to the Spooky Men's Chorale, who celebrated their 20th birthday this week. This is their arrangement of Rani Arbo's setting of Tennyson's Crossing the Bar, Sunset and Evening Star, and One Clear Call for Me. Sunset.
You've been listening to an ABC podcast. Discover more great ABC podcasts, live radio and exclusives on the ABC Listen app.